You're listening to the Virginia Press Room,
a joint production of the Virginia Public Access Project
and VPM. Now here's the host of the Press Room, Michael Pope.
In the press room this week, we are joined by an all-star panel of journalists from the Virginia Press Corps. First up is the State House reporter for the Virginian Pilot, Kate Seltzer. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are also joined by the State House reporter for Courthouse News, Joe Dodson. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be back.
Rounding out our all-star panel, making his third appearance on the Press Room podcast, is the State House reporter for VPM News, Jad Khalil. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks.
Third time's the charm. All right. Kate Seltzer, what's your headline of the week?
My headline of the week is the deadline to turn in your signatures to appear on the ballot for the primary this June was last Thursday. So we are been checking in on what's happening with the governor races and the lieutenant governor races. We know for sure that Abigail Spanberger is the Democratic nominee. She announced that last week. We know that Dave LaRock, who had challenged current Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears, is off the ballot. He turned in about 9,000 signatures, just shy of that 10,000 count that's required to appear on the ballot. And that means, go ahead.
I was going to ask you about that. Like, why bother turning in? So if the goal is you have to have 10,000 and some of those 10,000 are not going to be verified. So, I'm just wondering why bother turn in something that's not going to get you on the ballot?
I mean, I think his point was to show that he had garnered a good bit of support. Both he and Amanda Chase had declared their intent to run relatively late in the game with just 5 weeks to gather those 10,000 signatures necessary. So the fact that he came close is, I think, important to him. He also has talked about how Governor Glenn Youngkin's endorsement of Winsome Earle-Sears had made his task more difficult. So he will not appear on the ballot. At this point, it's still unclear whether Amanda Chase will. She has turned in all of the signatures available to her, but it's not clear what that number was. And it will take some time for the Republican Party to verify whether those signatures are all valid. In the meantime, still a pretty crowded field for the lieutenant governor race. We got some names back from the Democratic Party last week. We know that Alex Bastani, Ghazala Hashmi, Babur Latif, Aaron Rouse, Victor Salgado, and LeVar Stoney have all qualified for the Democratic primary ballot later this spring.
I feel like Lieutenant Governor Sears must feel like she has a weight off her shoulder. It's been kind of an anxious couple of months with LaRock and Amanda Chase both announcing that they would be running. She probably feels a lot better now knowing that she just needs to focus on being a Republican and not, differentiating herself between two other Republicans.
But wasn't she kind of damaged politically in all this? I mean, Kate was just making the point that LaRock, it was a show of strength for LaRock to collect all the signatures that he did. Even if he's not on the ballot, the process of collecting all those signatures means that LaRock is popular and maybe Sears might be in trouble.
I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think LaRock and Chase sort of both posited themselves as candidates who were more loyal to President Trump. They have talked about how in 2022, Sears had said that Trump was a liability to the Republican Party. So they had painted her as sort of insufficiently loyal to Trump.
I think that constituency is well known to the lieutenant governor, no matter what, also, though. So, the sort of, the people that are going to be throwing their weight behind LaRock or Amanda Chase, those are people that are going to be a known constituency in the Republican Party and the Virginia electorate to the lieutenant governor. So it'll be interesting. I mean, I guess the question is, do they stay home? Do they not? We have a long time before the general now. So
Joe Dodson of Courthouse News, you're next on this. What's your headline of the week?
Yeah, so some interesting Supreme Court of Virginia opinions dropped on last Thursday. One of those was a story I wrote about a detainee up in the Fredericksburg area. The police responded to an abandoned warehouse parking lot where they found a guy who was suicidal. They didn't find a gun on him, but they knew he had one. They detained him, put him in the back seat of the car. He complained about how hot he was in the car, so the officer opened the window. While the officer was looking around the area for the gun, he managed to grab a gun that the officer had.
Oh my God.
Yeah, the officer had placed on the front seat. That gun is from a traffic stop the day prior. The officer didn't put it into an evidence locker or anything like that because he claims the system was down. But this suicidal guy got his hands on a gun. They drive back to his house. And while the officer is out talking to his supervisor, the detainee managed to shoot himself in the head. He actually survived with some traumatic brain injury, and he sued for negligence for basically being an officer that had a suicidal detainee and allowing him access to a gun. So the high court, Virginia's high court, actually ruled that the officer is not liable because this detainee was a previous convicted felon. So him possessing a firearm is illegal. So basically, it's called the defense of illegality. And what it means is you can't get damages for an injury that occurred from you breaking the law. So he was breaking the law by possessing the firearm.
Wow.
So the case would have had a different outcome if he were not a convicted felon.
I believe so. Yeah, definitely. Because in that case, yeah, you really just look at the facts of it, and it's a guy left alone in a cop car with a gun when everyone knows that he's kind of on edge, for sure. So it was definitely a nice little defense for the officers to have. The Court of Appeals disagreed with that and said that a jury could find this guy negligent, but High Court ruled otherwise.
Was this was this the government attorney that was representing the police officer? Or what was that?
No, it was a private attorney from Thompson McMullen, John O'Haron. Yeah, it was private.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Jad Khalil of VPM News, you're next on this. What's your headline of the week?
So my headline of the week is the state budget amendments that passed through I guess not passed through. The governor had recommended a bunch of budget amendments, and the General Assembly had accepted, I want to say about 3 dozen of them out of 205 that he proposed. So the kind of the gist of it is that they mostly rejected what the governor had to do, but there was sort of an interesting difference between the House and the Senate. So Governor Youngkin wanted to make the earned income tax credit a higher proportion of that be permanent. So earned income tax credit is a tax credit that mostly affects lower income earners and tax filers. There's a expanded tax break or refund, I guess, that the governor wanted to have past its deadline of 2027. And the House of Delegates said, yeah, we're on board with that. But then the state Senate said, no, we're not. And because we're worried about, what's coming across the river, as they often say, because of all the stuff going on in Washington. But it was interesting because, one, they were on different pages, the House and the Senate, even though they're the same party. And this is a tax policy that has been really kind of one of the things that the progressives in Virginia have been pushing for a long time, including a lot of the Democrats in the General Assembly. So
that's what I thought was so interesting about this back and forth that happened last week, because for so many years, Democrats have been talking about making the earned income tax credit permanent, and it helps mainly low-income people, and this has been their policy direction. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, everything flips around, and the Republicans are talking about extending the earned income tax credits, and the Democrats are like, hold on, wait a second, fiscal responsibility, I don't know if we can afford to do this. So it was really a role reversal for everyone involved. You and I were in a gaggle with the Senate leaders after the session ended, and I asked them about that, And Senator Locke said, don't get it twisted. They don't care about low-income people. So what did you make of the role reversal?
I thought they were quite defensive in that gaggle, actually, because essentially, and I think it was Senator Obenshain said something like, "You're going to balance the budget on the backs of working class Virginians," and this is not a huge sort of number. I mean, it's a big nominal number for people at home, but like in the context of the budget, it's not. I think it's like $35 million per year or something like that. That's. They were going to drop that amount of money into, budget or business ready sites. So the fact that they were kind of keeping that available in case they needed to basically raise taxes on lower income families in case, things go south from, I don't know, it's a not unintended pun. If things go south from Washington in terms of all the federal budget cuts and that sort of thing. I just find that interesting that would be what they would resort to if they were the ones that were calling the shots. So,
if you're standing on the North Pole, every direction you go is south. Just something to think about. All right, now it's time for some insider info. Joe Dodson with Courthouse News, you're first on this. What's your insider info?
Yeah, so Kate and I, and Jad, I think you spent a lot of time in the house on Wednesday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we were hanging out in the house while our fearless leader here was in the Senate. And we listened to a lot of speeches, and a lot of them mentioned being terrified of Donald Trump. And I focused in on some of the gun legislation. The Democrats decided to pull a couple of gun bills from the block to discuss and kind of have their little soundbite about Youngkin, not caring about public safety and things like that. I think it's going to be really interesting next session when Delegate Freitas, who's decided not to run for re-election, isn't here, because a big rhetoric point for the Democrats is having former veteran Dan Helmer speak on gun control legislation as a veteran. So he uses the lines like, "These are weapons of war," and when referring to assault weapons or semi-automatic weapons. And, these are weapons I used when I was in war, and these are not something that should be on the street. Delegate Freitas is a Green Beret veteran, so he is always able to stand up and kind of speak back to that. Be interesting to see, this time next year, who the Republicans kind of select as the poster child for defending the Second Amendment.
Or just making speeches in general. I mean, Delegate Freitas was frequently on the Republican side, one of the members to stand up and make a speech, sometimes kind of pointed political speeches. So you're right to sort of game out, okay, so who's next once Freitas is off the scene? Who is the loquacious member of the Republican caucus? Any guesses?
Oh, my God.
What about... is it Morgan Griffin or Tim Griffin, the guy from Bedford who's new?
Yeah, Tim Griffin.
Yeah, I could see him. I mean, he made a little speech he took issue with, for those who weren't listening, a big part of Wednesday in the House of Delegates is that the speechwriter for the Democrats put in every single speech that they did a line about Republicans being too scared of Donald Trump. And very quickly into it, Delegate Griffin stood up and said, "Hey, we're not talking about Washington. We're not talking about Trump. We're talking about Virginia." Democrats proceeded to continue using the Trump line for 12 more speeches.
All the Republicans would laugh whenever that came up too.
Mm-hmm.
And they were there was some talk of you're laughing at the subject matter, and I have to say, objectively, I don't think that's true. I think that it was a really bad bit, and it just was super uncomfortable. I would have steered away from the bit after it kind of flopped. But
Yeah, speaking of Nick Freitas, he stood up and said he had a whole bit about the Democratic caucus must have met before then, and wouldn't be a totally sick burn if they all got up and did this.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll stitch them all together. And then that is actually, in fact, what the House GOP did, is they stitched all of those
I think though that
bites together.
with the whole bit that, they're essentially probably filming campaign ads, right? So, and a lot of times when you see the campaign ads, it'll be sort of the same format, right? They'll just kind of switch out the image or the subtitle or whatever. So it'll be Delegate X is afraid of Trump, Delegate Y is afraid of Trump, blah, 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 blah. And then, I think that's basically why they were doing that. And I think maybe people across Virginia aren't going to, kind of tune into that as much as us. So I think it's interesting. It was a very cheesy bit, but it also they probably got what they wanted from it. And the fact that the Republicans were laughing, I mean, that's basically B-roll that they might be able to use also. So
True, it might have been successful. Yeah, you're right.
So it's
And I think important to note that they immediately sustained most of Glenn Youngkin's vetoes, but they pulled out a couple specific bills that they knew they didn't have the numbers, the 2/3 majority, to override that veto, but wanted to speak on those subjects.
Jad Khalil of EPM News, you're next on this. What's your insider info?
So my insider info is, bear with me here a little bit. So there was a bill that was going to define tribal sovereignty in the Virginia Code, and this is important because a lot of the relationship between Native Virginia tribes and the Commonwealth of Virginia actually predate the federal government, and the federal government is usually the one that recognizes tribes initially. So it was only about 10, 15 years ago that Virginia tribes first started getting recognized, and now the code is basically catching up. So the governor recommended an amendment that actually struck out a specific line from the bill that said something about government-to-government relationships, which is basically the foundation of the federal law when it comes to tribal relations. And a lot of the efforts here are to bring Virginia into the into sort of alignment with the federal law. So it basically gutted the bill. But the insider info here is that this bill just sailed through the General Assembly the whole time. And, in years past when there's been bills that have had tribal, kind of redoing tribal relations, because this is something that's been going on since the state and federal government recognized, when the federal government recognized Virginia tribes. The administration had put in input and they had made changes. There was a bill last year about how the state has to consult with Virginia tribes about certain issues, and then they had put in a lot of input on that. This bill did not get that in public hearings throughout the process. But then, so it was interesting that this kind of came in and there was this change that happened, even though there was plenty of opportunity to do this throughout the process. And this is what sort of the point that I was trying to get to finally in terms of like the insider info is we had, during that gaggle that you mentioned earlier, we had Senate Democrats alleging that Republicans were going to them and saying, the governor's not really consulting with us on bills. So I find that sort of interesting. It makes me wonder how engaged the administration was on, this bill and other bills, whether it was for another reason why they put this amendment in. And yeah, that's my insider info.
It is really interesting how this governor is taking a different approach to input that previous governors did. And you hear this from the lawmakers all the time because they get upset about this. Like, we had all these hearings and the governor's people could have showed up and told us what they wanted, but they didn't do that.
This is not how we do this business in Virginia. This is like a line that we hear a lot.
Well, just from an efficiency standpoint, if the members of the General Assembly knew earlier in the process what the governor's concerns were, they might have been able to address them. But the way that he's approaching this, they finish what they're doing, then they send it to the governor, and then that's when they find out about all this stuff, and then it comes. So it's like, it might be a more efficient process if the governor and his people were more forthcoming about their opinions during the process.
Or they find out when the budget amendments come down, because apparently there weren't calls that were going out to lawmakers, which is something that is kind of a tradition, right? So
to be fair about the calls to the lawmakers, it's kind of hard when you're like doing a record number of vetoes and amendments. That's a lot of calls.
Yeah, that's 900 calls.
But it's also fewer calls if you're making those changes during the session. If you're like, make that change and then you don't have to do it in that time period. And it's less of a crunch for all the legal and policy staff. The governor's staff has to really go through all these bills, and they catch stuff that the lawmakers don't because they have sort of like a more hefty staff to go through stuff than the legislature does.
Kate Seltzer, the Virginian pilot. What's your insider info?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird one. So as Joe said, we were camped out in the House during reconvene session last week. Famously, a little bit of a less strict dress code in the House, if that's something you care about.
Are we really going to talk dress code?
No, that's the last thing I have to say about dress code. And so we were camped out there, and it's not unusual for the General Assembly to get off to kind of a slow start. They'll gavel in, and then they're immediately back in recess. But this was taking a little bit of an abnormally long time to get started. They're supposed to gavel in around noon, then it's 1 o'clock, and then it's 1:30. So
And the House is usually very punctual about if they're supposed to be gaveling in at noon, they gavel in right at noon. So this is an aberration.
Yes. So during that time, at one point, a delegate comes by and says, "You know why this is taking so long? It's because of the judicial appointment process, and there's concerns over in the Senate that there are too many Jews on the bench." So sort of how we got here is there's an opening on the Supreme Court, and that means essentially that there's going to be openings on the lower courts. So Judge Fulton moves up to the Supreme Court from the appellate court. Judge Duffin moves from the Virginia Beach Circuit Court to the appellate court. Now there's an opening on the Virginia Beach Circuit Court, and that's kind of where we come into this story. They had done all of the interviews of the judicial candidates the night before. Hadn't heard of any problems, but we hear this like weird rumor about this nominee to the Virginia Beach Circuit Court, who does happen to be Jewish. He's an attorney who has a firm in Portsmouth, but he lives in Virginia Beach. Then we hear House Speaker Don Scott come by and say essentially the same thing. So now it's kind of something, at least for a Hampton Roads readership, I've got to start asking people about what's happening over there. So I talked to Senator Bill DeSteph, who's from Virginia Beach, and asked him about all of this. He said that basically all of these rumors are unfounded and unfair, that the lawyer in question was a longtime friend of his, and in fact, Senator DeSteph had nominated him for a judgeship previously. And what had happened was that the Virginia Beach delegation learned of this guy's nomination pretty late in the day, Tuesday, and he says like half his delegation didn't know who the guy was, and that's not how things are done. They also wanted the Virginia Beach Bar to do some more vetting for him, which is how that usually works, although this guy had been vetted when he had been nominated the first time around. So it was just all around kind of odd. The General Assembly does eventually start happening at some point on the Senate side, and I think you were there for this. Senator Scott Servell says that they are going to vote on this joint resolution that confirms all of these judges minus this one guy from Virginia Beach. So yeah, it was just kind of this odd moment. House Speaker Don Scott says that he was hearing from Jewish constituents who made the point that for the first time in 20 years, Virginia Beach had a Jewish judge on the bench that they confirmed last year. And then this time around, they tried to add another Jewish person, and that was the sticking point.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a little far-fetched. Like that's a huge assumption to make, that someone's being like anti-Semitic in their Senate duties. But I will say it's interesting that he made such a big deal about being friends with the attorney, and then was like, people don't know enough about this guy. We should take a step back.
Oh, interesting.
You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Like that's kind of weird, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the sort of thing that if it ever came to light that somebody in that room said, I think we have enough Jews, like that would be a for real story and we would write about it. But in the meantime, I kind of think there's a world where everybody's telling the truth. Like maybe there were some Jewish constituents in Hampton Roads who rightfully or wrongfully had that perception of that's what was happening. And also, Republicans in the Senate felt like they had not had appropriate time to meet with this guy.
Sure.
On the judges, it is kind of interesting. that in Wisconsin, they elected a Supreme Court judge last week, and it was the most expensive election ever in the history of elections, right? And Elon Musk said the fate of Western civilization rests on this election. And in Virginia, they added a Supreme Court justice on a Wednesday in the afternoon. I mean,
It's a very little fanfare, yeah.
very little fanfare. All right. But you know what has a lot of fanfare is our next segment, which is our game show segment, Buy, Sell, or Hold. I'll present a topic, and our panelists will make a choice. Do they want to buy, sell, or hold? Our topic today, the part-time legislature. These people are not full-time lawmakers. Most of them have day jobs, and so they come here part-time. Jad Khalil of EPM News, you're first with this. Buy, sell, or hold on the part-time legislature.
Huge sell. We spend a lot of time in the legislature, rushing through bills because we only have, 45 or 60 days to do them. A lot of that time is spent fixing things that happened when things were being rushed. We have a lot of attorneys that are in the legislature because essentially, like, if you're not wealthy, it's very difficult to be in the legislature. And yeah, I think those are three pretty good reasons to sell. So huge sell. I've been a huge sell for a long time.
Kate Seltzer of the Virginia Pilot, you're next on this. Buy, sell, or hold on the part-time legislature.
Yeah, I'm a sell as well. I don't know if I'm a huge sell, although I like that stance. For all of the points Jad said, I do like that. I like the idea, and I'm not sure it's always effectively executed, but the idea that we should have lawmakers who are teachers or come from other walks of life who are not full-time lawmakers.
That's a really important point that we should consider in this discussion, which is like Senator Van Valkenburg is a teacher. So when he speaks on the topic of education, he brings professional experience to that discussion. Cliff Hayes had an AI bill this year, and he works in that field and has like decades of experience doing that sort of stuff. So when he was talking about artificial intelligence, he brings a level of professional expertise to it. So like that's something that you would lose if you had professional politicians in the General Assembly who had no professional background in anything.
I don't know.
And then
if we
also you would
lose that.
miss out on a lot of people. Like, when the session ended, we had a party in the press room, and one of the delegates was there, and he said, "Look, if this was a full-time legislature, you couldn't afford me." In other words, he wouldn't run for a full-time position because he could make way more money doing what he does now.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to push back a little bit on the idea that sort of the subject matter expertise that comes in, because you have lots of legislators that are learning about topics that they wouldn't be learning about in their jobs because they're talking to so many people in that field also. So, if you have somebody that's really interested in clean energy, like they're going to be talking to lots of people all the time throughout this process, and they'd be essentially kind of doing that throughout the year as well. So, and I think if they're coming at it from, they were previously a teacher and then they came in and then they're on the education committee and then they're doing this and then they're also doing it all the time because it's a full-time legislature. And probably full-time legislature, which is one thing that we didn't discuss, it probably involves more staff. So they're going to have more people to reach out to constituents, to sort of talk with stakeholders and do all these things. I think that's sort of an assumption. I mean, a full-time legislature with, the same amount of staff would probably be pretty difficult. So it would be more expensive. I think that's one thing that people count against the full-time.
Joe Dodson of Courthouse News, give us an answer here. Buy, sell, or hold on the part-time legislature.
I'm a buy. From a reporter standpoint, I'm a sell because I wish I had more things to report on, but for longer of the year, and I like hanging out with all of y'all. But as a voter, I actually am definitely a buy because just of some of the points we've talked about earlier, and not just like the expertise. Like, yes, it's really nice to have folks from all walks of life in terms of their employment. I will say, like, Schuyler Van Valkenburg is like part of the reason that he's able to do that is because he lives in the area. I don't think like a teacher from Southwest Virginia would be able to do that, but I just think that it has to do more with like living amongst your people. So I think it's a good thing that for 11 months or 10 and a half months of the year, these are folks that are in those communities in Southwest Virginia, in rural Virginia, in 757, living amongst them instead of living amongst other Richmonders.
All right, now it's time to open up our reporter's notebook. This is when our top journalists tell us what to be on the lookout for this week. Kate Seltzer, the Virginian Pilot, you're first on this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
Yeah, I'm looking into what's happening with existing cases that are open with the Office of Civil Rights through the Department of Education. The Office of Civil Rights is kind of the enforcement arm, or was kind of the enforcement arm of the Department of Education. And a couple of weeks ago, when the announcement came down that they intended to dismantle it, there's like a database that shows all of the open cases, and that has become like very difficult to access. I've been accessing it through the Wayback Machine, and had like kind of copy and pasted a bunch of stuff into a spreadsheet, which is a like super imperfect way of tracking that data. So I've been trying to just sort of figure out what will happen to people who have these open cases. Some of them have been open for years, and that's something I've heard from experts and advocates, is that a lot of these cases, which are civil rights cases with individual universities and school systems, they wind up over there when it's like a really tricky situation, in part because the process is very slow moving. It's likely that you won't necessarily get the outcome you're hoping for in the time that you need it, but it might make things better for the people coming after you. So what I've heard from folks is that the OCR was like a deeply imperfect system, but kind of better than nothing. And I'm just not hearing a lot of guidance with what's happening to those folks who have open cases. So actually, if you're listening and that's you, and you want to chat about it and what you're hearing, my inbox is always open.
Kate Seltzer of the Virginian Pilot, hit her up if you know something, because she wants to add you to her reporter's notebook. Joe Dodson of Courthouse News, you're next on this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
So I'll have to give a shout out to start this to Greg. I think it's Greg Schneider of the Washington Post. He's the first person I saw reporting on it last week when the lawsuit dropped. But it's definitely something my company is going to be paying attention to in the future as the suit moves forward. And it's a lawsuit, the Nansemond Indian tribe. They're located in the 757 area. They sued the state, accusing them of withholding Medicaid reimbursements and discriminating against tribal healthcare providers in an effort to protect the interest of managed care organizations. There's 5 managed care organizations in Virginia. They're all owned by major health insurers. So anyways, folks from this tribe allege that this is making it so that folks can't get the care that they deserve in their communities and are instead being pushed out to these MCOs, which offer far less quality care.
That is, I was reading that story with a lot of interest, and also in light of the amendment that I was talking about earlier, because the governor was striking out the government to government relations from the code, and I believe that line was also part of the lawsuit where this is there's basically like sovereignty sort of arguments that are being made by the tribes. So maybe this came up because this was all happening like pretty recently, right? That they sort of they stopped, they were withholding payments to the healthcare provider.
Yeah, they claim that this started in October 2024. They claim a recent audit kind of revealed what they had already suspected, which is that a lot of money was being withheld. They want to expand. These centers are called the Fishing Point Healthcare Centers that the tribe uses. They want to expand to dental and other care options, not just for folks in their tribe, but also other low-income folks in the area. But
this is like Hampton Roads area, right? So
it is, yeah. So I think they have one in Portsmouth, and I don't want to get that wrong. I think they have 3 in the 757. I'm not sure exactly where.
Mm-hmm.
Jad Khalil of VPM News, closing out our podcast with a strong finish. What's in your reporter's notebook?
I think I need to open my reporter's notebook. I think
There it is. It's right in front of your...
But don't you need to it needs the sound, right?
Props.
Oh, yeah. Open it up in front of the microphone.
Yeah, but don't there's like the like the What's the sound that you on your little board? Like the here. Oh no, not that one. Oh, wow.
Jad, what is in your reporter's notebook?
That's Michael telling me to not do that again on the podcast. My reporter's notebook. Let me here. Campaign finance. So the reporting period finished last week, and reports are due later. But we're going to see people kind of putting out press releases, being like, "Hey, I got all this money. Like, I'm the most viable candidate, so you better like get in on the ground floor." And that is also like sort of like a indication of ground game support, popularity, all those sorts of things. So you see a lot of the candidates doing that. And it's also sort of interesting because people that are in the legislature aren't allowed to fundraise. So,
During the session.
During the session,
They
right.
can
Right.
now at this hour.
And that's what they do a lot of. Like as soon as the, gavel out, pick up the phone, start calling people is, so it'll be interesting to see, how that affected folks. So like you have the lieutenant governor's race for the Democrats, for example, like former mayor, Richmond Mayor LeVar Stoney has been able to fundraise throughout the session. Senators Aaron Rouse and Ghazal Hashmi haven't been able to. So those are what I think are probably like the three front runners in that, even though there's, probably a lot of people that are undecided there. So it's still anybody's game. If you want to see where that campaign finance reports are, you could go to the Department of Elections. But if you want a more user-friendly experience, you can go to our patrons here at the podcast, the Virginia Public Access Project.
Shout out to our friends at the Virginia Public Access Project, because their website really makes this easy in terms of figuring out where the money's coming from and also where the money's going, right? So if you click on a candidate, you can see who the top contributors are. Then you can click through to see who else they're donating money to, and you can also kind of follow to some extent where the money is going, although that's also largely dependent on the campaigns, because if you look at how they spend the money, sometimes they'll just say like Visa bill, and you don't know what they bought with the Visa, right?
Oh, really?
That's not VPAP's problem. That's because that's
Like
how the
credit card
candidates,
bill.
right? That's
Yeah.
how the candidates present the information. So
Stuff.
yeah, stuff. But yeah, so what you brought up campaign finance records and disclosures. What do we know about the state of the race right now, looking at their campaign finance numbers?
I don't know. I wouldn't be able to say like with like some authoritativeness, just because everybody tries to play up their own numbers, and they sort of like will be like, oh, this is the biggest record for XYZ, and and there's all these caveats and that sort of thing.
I think Lieutenant Governor Sears said that she raised the most that a Republican had raised in the first quarter with $3 million, something like that. So I guess that's why like her numbers are just coming out now, but we heard about Abigail Spanberger's like a couple weeks ago, because she doesn't have to. I'm assuming that these rules about financing apply to the lieutenant governor as well, as she's not supposed to be doing too much fundraising during session.
Oh, interesting. I'm
not sure. I'm
I don't
asking.
I think that was right. I think that was part of her announcement.
Gotcha.
She had raised that much.
I always find the workaround that's really funny too, because like the day before session starts, they all have a big fundraiser, right? So they're collecting money like on the hour before they start meeting. But
I mean, they had a huge fundraiser plan for Wednesday night. The Democrats did for after the reconvened session. I'm not sure if they ever ended up doing that, considering how late we were all in the building, but that was the plan.
This is the press room. We're busy.
That's it for this episode of The Press Room, a joint production of the Virginia Public Access Project and VPM News. If you enjoyed the show, please consider supporting VPAP and supporting VPM. Hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcasting app. Hey, write a review. That includes you guys. You need to write a review on Apple Podcasts.
I think I did a great job.
And we'll be back next episode for the next episode of the Virginia Press Room.